The Subcommittee on Homeland Security will come to order. During today's virtual hearing, members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. When you are recognized to speak, if I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. To avoid inadvertent background noise, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participant microphones when they are not recognized to speak. If there's a technology issue during the member's speaking time, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. We will be following the 5-minute rule. With 1 minute remaining in your time, the clock on your screen will turn yellow. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and it will be time to recognize the next member. We will follow the speaking order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, followed by members present at the time the hearing is called to order, in order of seniority, and we will alternate by party. Next, we will go to members who were not present when the hearing was called to order until every member present has had a first round. Members can submit information in writing at any of our hearings or markups using the email address provided in advance to your staff. So let's begin. I welcome James Murray, Director of the United States Secret Service. This is the Director's first time to testify in front of the subcommittee, and he is here to discuss his agency's operations, particularly its protective security activities. Director Murray, you are charged with 2 primary missions: protecting the President, key officials, and foreign dignitaries, and investigating threats to our currency and financial systems and infrastructures. This presidential transition year, the Secret Service has a heavy protective workload that began with the completed presidential inauguration. There are also several major national special security events tentatively planned, including high-level summits and the UN General Assembly in New York City. In addition, the agency is protecting a comparatively large number of protectees beyond the president, vice president, and their families. This includes some from the prior administration who have been temporarily extended protection. I hope you will use this hearing as an opportunity to provide us with a candid assessment of whether your current year funding is sufficient to carry out your protection responsibilities. We appropriated extra funding in our fiscal year 2021 bill in anticipation of these costs, but I am concerned about whether those resources are sufficient. We also want to hear details about your challenges related to cyber fraud, maintaining a workforce hiring pipeline, and training capacity aligned with future staffing requirements and operations during the pandemic. While I know you are still limited in what you can say about the budget request for the coming year, we will want to have a good discussion about what it will take to address all of these challenges, both now and in fiscal year 2022. I would now like to turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I appreciate your opening remarks and holding this hearing today. Director Murray, thank you very much for being with us here today as we discuss operational priorities for the Secret Service. I hope we get a chance at some point, sir, to discuss the fiscal year 2022 budget requests in the near future. I do want to say, since we spoke recently about a week or so ago, I had the privilege of meeting with your local folks from the Nashville and Chattanooga offices, as I do on a regular basis. They are truly, like yourself, sir, outstanding, but I wanted to convey that we've had that meeting. As I've told you before, I have tremendous pride working with the Secret Service as the ranking member of this subcommittee. And it goes without saying, but you and your agents have done an incredible job throughout this pandemic. You've successfully managed protective operations throughout a long and contentious election cycle under the threat of COVID and transitioned seamlessly from one administration to another, valiantly securing the increased number of protectees under the agency's watch. Additionally, you've also made significant strides in countering financial fraud and cyber crimes, a growing threat as government COVID assistance programs are hit by fraudsters and criminals who have come out of the woodwork in an attempt to exploit programs intended to help support those individuals most in need during these difficult times. So thank you for protecting both the needy from these hoaxes as well as the integrity of our financial systems. Most impressively, all of this work was done in a pandemic in which you took the necessary and proactive steps to protect your frontline workforce, laying out a comprehensive plan that you briefed us on and then stuck to it. Though a number of your employees have contracted the coronavirus, to date, you have had 0 casualties as a result of contracting the virus, which, considering the day-to-day work your workforce conducts every day, is a significant accomplishment. So thank you for a job well done. Though the world has changed tremendously over the past year, I know that many of the priorities of the Secret Service remain unchanged. But I also know that you are constantly looking to evolve with the threat landscape, ensuring that you stay ahead of any adversaries. So I look forward to our discussion today on how you see the Secret Service moving forward, the challenges you look to overcome, and the priorities you plan to put in place to meet them. Thank you again, Director Murray. I look forward to your testimony today, which I hope does not include any proposals to leave the Department of Homeland Security. I really enjoy working with the Secret Service. Madam Chair, I thank you and I yield back.
Director Murray, we will submit the full text of your official statement for the hearing record. Please begin your oral summary, which I would ask you to keep to 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss operations, initiatives, and future planning that is ongoing here in the Secret Service. While I understand that discussions concerning the fiscal year 2022 budget are being deferred, I am eager to share with you examples of the vital work being performed by the men and women of our agency. In a year beset by extraordinary challenges due to COVID-19, I'm grateful for the resiliency and adaptability of our workforce, the active support of their families, and the unwavering commitment to protect our nation's leaders and safeguard our country's financial infrastructure. Despite the global health challenges and the dynamic operational tempo of the past year, the Secret Service continued to make progress in a number of critical areas. Thanks to your support, we completed work on security enhancements to E Street inside the White House zone and made significant progress on constructing the permanent White House fence. We also strengthened partnerships with state and local law enforcement through our National Computer Forensics Institute, or NCFI, as well as through our network of cyber fraud task forces. From a hiring standpoint, we are actively working to achieve our fiscal year 21 goal of 7,900 positions, a historic number for our agency and one that moves us a step closer to our long-term human capital goals. To achieve this level of growth while keeping everyone safe, we did move many pre-employment activities to a virtual environment. To further our goal of building and maintaining a diverse workforce, our recruitment branch conducted a number of recruiting events in conjunction with historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, as well as a number of women's organizations and various branches of the military. With respect to retention, the various initiatives that this subcommittee has funded and supported over the past 5 years have resulted in a steady decline in attrition. The largest of these being the Uniform Division Group Retention Program, which is notable for its high enrollment rate and a measurable decline in attrition over the past several years. Throughout the pandemic, our men and women worked tirelessly to carry out our protective mission. While all campaign years present unique challenges, COVID-19 severely altered protectee patterns of life and required operational adjustments to keep everyone safe. What's more, our people successfully led the security planning for 5 National Special Security Events, or NSSEs. The foundation of success when it comes to NSSEs lies in our partnerships with agencies across all levels of government and the extensive planning that goes into securing those events. While protection is inherently a no-fail mission, Secret Service criminal investigations also have an impact upon national and economic security. The sustained investigative focus by our agents and analysts on cyber-enabled financial crimes has resulted in the prevention of more than $9.5 billion in potential fraud loss over the past several years. The various COVID relief programs passed by Congress also unfortunately attracted criminal activity. The Secret Service continues to do our part to protect communities in this regard. Over the past year, the agency has disrupted hundreds of online pandemic-related scams, opened more than 750 COVID-related cases, and seized in excess of $800 million in COVID-related fraud. The success of our integrated mission is entirely reliant on the world-class training provided at our Raleigh Training Center. After a 2.5-month closure prompted by the pandemic, RTC opened its doors again in June of 2020, just the second federal law enforcement training facility to safely do so. I thank the members of this subcommittee for their support, which has allowed the Secret Service to make smart infrastructure investments at our Raleigh Training Center. I'm committed to the pursuit of future projects so that our facilities best approximate environments that our agents and officers encounter while on duty. Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful for your support of our people and our mission over the years. The targeted investments made by this subcommittee have amplified our success in many areas. With your support, we have heavily invested in measures that have enhanced our protective methodologies and our capabilities. Moreover, your support and concern for the men and women of the Secret Service has been unwavering. On their behalf, I thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Okay. Thank you, Director Murray. Director Murray, it's always challenging for an agency to try to budget in advance for a fiscal year, but it's even harder to do when you can't predict whether or not there will be a presidential transition. In addition to these presidential transition costs, the total number of additional protectees beyond the president and vice president is higher than it's been in the past. What have your obligations been like for protection activities so far? And do you anticipate your current budget keeping pace with your obligations, or do you foresee budget problems as we move further into the fiscal year?
Thank you for your question, ma'am. You are very much correct. It's always difficult inside and outside of a campaign year when it comes to the protective side of the house to predict how much protective travel there'll be. And then when you compound that with a situation as you've described, where this is the first one-term presidency in about 28 years, I believe, in order to plan for that, it's also challenging. And then on top of that, you have additional protectees that we didn't anticipate before the end of the year. So those are all key considerations. While COVID has sort of tamped down the amount of protective travel, we are starting to see it uptick. And I think as COVID improves, we'll see that continue. And I think we'll also see a rise in travel by foreign heads of state and heads of government here to this country, along with their spouses, which is also a Secret Service responsibility. So right now, the tempo is not overwhelming. I do think as we go through the third quarter and into the fourth quarter, it's going to be a challenge. And I think that's going to cause us to make some decisions. There are some critical needs writ large with regard to protection. One of those being some of the experiences we've had over the past year with regard to civil disturbance. We found that we did not have enough of our folks trained in civil disturbance. We did not have enough equipment in that regard. Likewise, with regard to our threat management efforts or protective intelligence efforts, we are heavily invested in making sure that we're aware of any threats that exist out there in open source environment. And that requires a lot of equipment and technology, which is always emerging. So those are some areas I'm concerned about before we get into the next fiscal year in terms of being fully funded. Okay,
well, please keep us abreast of things as they happen. And you mentioned some of the other things that have happened that were unexpected, like the January 6th Capitol attack. How has that influenced the agency's security posture as it relates to staffing and resources? And I'm going to ask the second part of that. Has the January 6th Capitol attack led to a reevaluation of the process for national security, special security event designations? And if so, what out-year planning is taking place for future NSSEs?
Yes, ma'am. I'll try to answer them in order, but I'm also mindful of your time. So please let me know if you need me to pause. So we're always looking to capitalize on lessons learned. And obviously what happened on January 6th was abhorrent. It was an attack on our democracy, and we in law enforcement and public safety can't let it happen again. But again, whether it's something as significant as that, or even something as we saw across the pond in the UK last week, where there's an incident over in Manchester, we're always looking to capitalize on our own lessons learned and observe what happens with partner agencies. So certainly, definitely took those lessons learned and implemented them into the security plan that we carried out 2 weeks later for the inaugural, and we'll continue to do that. With respect to your question about national special security events, as you know, ma'am, that's not something that the Secret Service designates. We serve as the lead operational agency for operational security. I would imagine that there'll be conversations ongoing as to whether an event like the one we had on January 6th, and I say the event, I don't mean the incident, I mean the actual constitutional process, whether or not that should fall inside the confines of something like an NSSE. I welcome those conversations, and I imagine those are forthcoming.
Thank you. I am running out of time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Mr. Director. I know significant work has been done in replacing and improving much of the existing fencing on the White House grounds over the past few years, and this project will continue through fiscal year 2022. I also know that over the last year, we've seen a significant amount of temporary fencing erected throughout D.C. as a result of civil unrest from the White House to the Capitol, which not only incurs significant cost for the installation and maintenance of these fences, but restricts Americans from the ability to visit and observe these sites, albeit from a significant distance away. Do you feel the level of permanent fencing and security measures currently in place are sufficient for the Secret Service to carry out their protective mission? And secondly, sir, do you believe there should be a more permanent solution in place to alleviate the need for the recurring installation of temporary anti-climb fencing around the White House and Capitol, sir?
Thank you, sir, for your question. First and foremost, thank you, sir, and Madam Chairwoman and this committee for your support, because that new permanent White House fence, that is a game changer for us. We began construction on that going back to 2019. We recently finished up on the north side of the White House, soon expect to finish up the south side, and by this time next year, that permanent White House fence will be fully installed. Again, that should afford not only the Secret Service to have some enhancements operationally, but it also should afford the opportunity for our citizenry to come back onto Pennsylvania Avenue and view the White House as they should. With respect to your second part of your question, that is a consideration with regard to whether or not there should be a secondary screening point or secondary barrier as we push out of the White House perimeter. It's something we do for NSSEs, as you mentioned. It's something we're doing right now with the erection of the anti-scale fence that's up around the White House. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to take a hard look at and probably look to invest in the future.
Thank you, sir. Based on the events of January 6th, when the Secret Service was responsible for and successfully protected then Vice President Pence and Vice President-elect Harris when they were in the Capitol, as well as other civil unrest events throughout the year, the Secret Service has undoubtedly identified areas where they could make improvements to better prepare for and respond to similar types of events in the future, which all of us hope never happen, but know that we still must prepare for. Other than improved or additional fencing, which was already discussed, what areas do you feel, sir, the Secret Service could either make improvements to or use more resources to address preparations for and response to future events of this type, sir?
Well, sir, I'd like to talk about our training facility, because that comes right to my mind as we talk about this. So the one thing that our agents and officers don't have at our training facility, and I should say we're extremely grateful, we're one of the few federal law enforcement agencies to have a training facility inside the National Capital Region. That's a blessing. But the one thing we don't have there is anything that replicates our permanent protected facilities, such as the White House. So if I can give you a clunky analogy, if everybody on this call, if we were all on a basketball team, but we didn't have a gym to practice in and we didn't have baskets, we had to go out onto a field and practice basketball. But when we played our games, we went to a gym. How effective would our practice be? So long term, what I'm looking to invest in is to create and construct venues that replicate the areas of operation that our officers and agents work in. I'm looking to build things like White House training facilities, not only structurally, but also dimensionally. I think that's going to be something that's going to serve the security of this country and the Secret Service for many decades to come.
Well, thank you, sir, for your responses. And as my time is waning, I know we have a lot of folks who want to answer questions. Thank you, sir. And Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
I apologize. I'm trying to find who's next in line here. Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Thank you so much for holding this meeting. Director Murray, I also want to thank you for your service and what your men and women do. Before I ask my question about the National Computer Forensic Institute, I thought some years ago we were talking about appropriating monies for a White House replica. I remember it was a pricey amount. Do you know what happened with that? I thought we had talked about this some years ago.
Yes, sir. I know there was a conversation about committing some funds to design plans, and I think there was perhaps other choices that had to be made within the department and in the executive branch. I don't think we ever really got to move the ball down the field, so to speak, with regard to that. But we're eager to do so now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly think you need to have that replica at least of the White House, because that's one of your missions on that. But yeah, we'll follow up on that, because I know some years ago we talked about it and it was a pricey figure. But let me talk to you about your National Computer Forensic Institute. One of the things, as you know, I represent the border area, and one of the areas, you know, some of the dynamics you see it on TV, the unaccompanied kids, the family units, but there's another dimension there, a darker side that you know, you got criminal organizations. So my question is, what can we do to work with? And I'm on the road, as you can tell, in South Texas, and I just made a call to some of the border sheriffs and asked them if they were familiar with the National Computer Forensic Institute, and they're not. And I would ask you, what can we do to improve or establish some of that partnership? And I know you're pulled all over the country, but I would like to work with your office, if you can assign somebody to work with the border sheriffs and the border law enforcement and with their counterparts across the river on the Mexican side, so they can become not only local and state partners, but international partners, as we have this very dynamic part of the country called the Southwest border on that. So I'd like to see what you're doing and what we can do together, and assign somebody that we can work with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question and your interest, and very eager for the sheriffs and our international partners to participate in the NCFI mission. As you know, and the members of this committee, the subcommittee know, NCFI opened its doors back in 2008. And since that time, we've trained more than 13,000 state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges. So our doors have been open for 13 years. But candidly, they would not have been able to stay open without the active support of this subcommittee. And I'm particularly grateful to not only the members, but also the senior staff of the subcommittee, who have been highly encouraging of us to do better with regard to self-advocacy in this regard. And I'm hopeful as we get into 2022 and beyond, we'll get even more budgetary consideration. But as you know, one of the great success stories of NCFI is that we've trained all these folks from all 50 states, several territories, covering more than 2,000 agencies. It's a give back, because these are the same agencies we rely on when we come into town for protective services. But at the same time, it's also symbiotic in that these same folks are coming back and participating in our cyber fraud task forces. So they're also enhancing the Secret Service's investigative mission, more importantly, we train them, we give them all the equipment and the technology they need to go back and support their own departments. Sir, as you mentioned, a lot of these local and county departments don't have the budget to go ahead and start their own cyber investigative units. So these folks that we train go back into your communities and they investigate crimes that are important to your constituents. And the vast majority of the ones they do have to do with endangered persons and crimes against children. I'm not sure if we froze.
We may have lost Mr. Cuellar. Okay. So I'm going to go then to Ms. Hinson.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I do appreciate you holding this hearing today so we can hear from Director Murray on the agency's needs and priorities going into the next fiscal year. And Director Murray, thank you so much for your service as well and for appearing before us today. And I know many of the questions have already centered around a lot of the physical threats and what you do to combat those, but I wanted to kind of focus in on the work that the Secret Service does to protect taxpayers from financial crimes. Your testimony that you submitted mentions transnational cybercrime and financial crime specifically, things like ATM attacks. Can you share a little bit more about what international bad actors most concern you at the Secret Service, in addition to the example you gave in your testimony of North Korea?
Yes, ma'am. So we are seeing, we recently, as you know, merged two long-standing task force operations. One was the long-standing Financial Crimes Task Force we've had in place since the 1980s. The other one was what we call the Electronic Crimes Task Force that has been around since 1995. We realized that as the great work they were all doing was sort of unintentionally redundant in a lot of ways, and we were plowing down the same roads. So we decided, with your support and the support of the department, to merge those and create this cyber fraud task force. We have 44 of these across the country and some overseas as well. And the way we combat the kind of activity you're talking about is through that and through the NCFIs I've described. What we're seeing is, most of the complex financial fraud that goes on right now in this country and around the world is digital in some nature. And the vast majority of the financial crime that we look at is cyber related, and it is being perpetrated by transnational groups from abroad. They do exploit people here, some people wittingly and some people otherwise. But as you mentioned, we're seeing what we call ATM cash outs. We're seeing a lot of ransomware issues. One thing we've seen an uptick in during COVID, especially, is something called business email compromise, which is where these bad actors using social engineering or sometimes network intrusion get into a system and they perpetrate that they are part of a legitimate business process within an organization, and they effectuate wire transfers outside of an organization. And then what happens is all those ill-gotten funds are transmitted back to the transnational groups via cryptocurrency, which is a separate and unique challenge unto itself.
Right. So tracking it then becomes an extra challenge, obviously. Would you say in general, Director, that they are using these funds to undermine the safety of America and the security of our allies, for instance? Obviously, these are going to countries that are no friend to the United States.
Absolutely. And that's a great question. I know that it's very easy to put these types of offenses in the bucket of white collar crime. And I understand why they do that. But if we just take a look, not so much at corporations, but the public utilities, hospitals, schools, care centers, when those are attacked with something like ransomware and they're threatened with, deletion of services, you're putting people's lives at risk. Mm-hmm. And, it's candidly, for these transnational groups, it is all about the money. They're not really concerned about the safety and security of our citizenry like you are and I am, but that's why we're so heavily invested in it. And I think a big part of the solution is education. I think up to this point, very recently, public, private sector both had this idea that this is nice to have these sort of redundancies and resiliencies and have a plan for continuity of operations. It's absolutely need to have nowadays.
Right. So I guess I'd close out with the remaining time. What resources do you need to better prevent and respond to those kinds of attacks? And then who are you most closely allied with and working with to help prevent these attacks?
Thank you. So the one thing we always need continual reinvestment in is things like equipment, technology, and obviously people. That's a best practice. It's a people, process, technology approach. And, we kind of subscribe to the idea that the speed and capability of technology doubles every couple of years. So that's tough to keep up with when you're inside of a multi-year budget cycle, but we do our best, and we appreciate the continued support of the committee. Obviously, a big challenge for us coming up will be 5G, the transition to 5G. That's going to have a direct impact on our mobile wireless investigations. That's something we conduct via our cyber fraud task forces. We conduct them in your communities. We started it out as a part of our threat management program. However, it is something that has proliferated to where we actively support police officers, police agencies in your districts with regard to locating digital devices that belong to missing persons, children who have been kidnapped, homicide suspects, and so forth. So as we go to 5G, it is a challenge and expensive proposition, but if we don't keep up with that technology, we'll not be able to continue to perform that task as well as we do.
All right.
And lastly, with regard to your question about who we partner with, we partner very much with CISA within the department and also the FBI. And we have strong ties through our cyber fraud task forces with academia and the business sector.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Director, for answering those questions. And Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Underwood. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Director, thank you for the good work you do and for your testimony here today. I appreciated the overview you gave of the COVID situation with respect to your personnel. And of course, there's some alarming news about the levels of exposure but also good news that in the vast majority of cases, these were not serious cases. I want to ask you a little bit more about the lessons learned, though, and not that this is over, but we're hopefully past the worst of it. You're certainly past the point of the protection required in a presidential campaign. I wonder if you could reflect on that a bit. There were some incidents through the campaign period, which we all remember. I guess the one that was the most obviously alarming was the president's decision to, when he was actually hospitalized with the COVID virus, the president's decision to take an automobile ride around to greet his supporters who had gathered out at Walter Reed. And clearly Secret Service had to protect him in that situation. But there were all kinds of campaign events that were distancing and masking were not practiced. And there were lots of questions, legitimate questions raised about these possibly being spreader events. Now, I understand that the Secret Service has no choice but to salute and offer protection, whatever the circumstances. I appreciate that, and of course, that's part of the service and part of the sacrifice that we admire. On the other hand, there should be some advisory role, I would think, or some ability of the Secret Service to offer at least advice when such events are being planned, and they inevitably are going to have to include protection. And there needs to be, I would think, in retrospect, some assessment of the kind of dangers to which your agents were exposed, and to what extent those just come with the territory, and the extent to which there ought to be some kind of process for minimizing these dangers. What can you tell us about that? I think it's it's a legitimate concern, and there are particular problems, as we all know, with the past president and the past campaign. But it's not unlikely that these kinds of issues could arise in the future as well.
Yes, sir. If I may, I'll do my best to be succinct, but I'd like to take you back to about February of 2020. That's when we started to realize that this thing called coronavirus, whatever it was, might have a negative impact on our campaign operations. The one thing we realized very quickly was that if we did get to a point where our workforce couldn't come to their primary places of work, we didn't have the bandwidth for folks to work virtually. So we made some quick investments in that and solved that problem. At the same time, I don't know if we really knew what PPE was going to be, but we quite literally took stock of what we had in terms of gloves, masks, cleaning materials, and we secured more, thinking that might be factor for us as well. Simultaneously, through our chief medical officer, who ultimately was a key member of the coronavirus task force and works closely with NIH, we set up our own robust testing program right next door, actually, in our headquarters that's still open today, where we test people sort of by design before and after protective travel. But I do want to make it clear, it was communicated by me and by my leadership team over and over again that the expectation was that we would follow CDC guidelines and then some with regard to PPE. Matter of fact, if anything, if we were guilty of anything with regard to quarantining folks, we would go beyond the primary contacts. What we would do is we started staffing our operations, at least initially, in sort of a port and starboard approach, where we'd platoon people. We'd send one group of people out, they'd be on duty for a couple weeks, then we replaced them with a fresh group. And if any of those were exposed, then everybody came off the line. So those are some of the measures that we took initially, we built on over time. With respect to your other questions about specific incidences, as you mentioned, the Secret Service, it's inherently a dangerous job for sure. And we are in the business of making an assessment as to whether a particular operation can be achieved. We really don't get involved in whether it should or shouldn't be achieved from an optical standpoint, but I appreciate your question. With regard to the matter at Walter Reed, which I think you were referring to, I will tell you this, there was extensive conversation about that with the medical professionals, the White House Medical Unit, and the medical professionals at Walter Reed. Ultimately, the decision was that it could be achieved, and the two individuals that were in the vehicle were wearing the same level of PPE and protective gear that not only the medical professionals at Walter Reed were wearing, but that the frontline health workers are wearing around the world every day since COVID started.
All right, thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Director. Great to see you here this morning, and thank you for your testimony here today. You know, as was mentioned earlier, I was a little concerned when I didn't see the Secret Service in the skinny budget at all, even mentioned. So, Director, could you talk just a little bit about going into next year? What would you like to see in that budget when it comes out? What are the priorities for you moving forward next year? I know the recapitalization of the Academy Training Center, Rowley Training Center. Can you talk about some of those needs that you see coming that we should be focused on here in Congress?
Yes, sir. So very, very broadly, continued investment in our cyber fraud task forces and in our field operations. Likewise, continued investment in the National Computer Forensics Institute, which I'm happy to say I feel we were certainly heard this time around. With regard to staffing, obviously we are highly committed to our human capital strategic plan, which gets the agency to somewhere around 95 by fiscal year 2026. And I thank you very much for your continued support with regard to that. Obviously continued investment in our retention methods, which are also thanks to you. Some of the programs we have, like student loan repayment, tuition assistance, child subsidy care, and the max out relief that we received for our employees who work overtime for protective services. On the protective side of the house, I said it earlier, but it bears repeating, looking for consideration with regard to our threat management efforts, our protective intelligence efforts, with specific regard to our open source investigation capabilities. That means the ability to go out and identify that threatening behavior or activity might be, or language might exist on the internet, so to speak. Whereas 25 years ago, you might be at a restaurant and somebody says something that sounds like a threat against a president, and you're reliant entirely on the good citizen report it. Now it exists out there to be found by the Secret Service. And lastly, continued investment in our protective efforts. As I mentioned earlier, we really need to improve with regard to our resourcing with readiness in terms of civil disturbance and training.
What about your field communications? Is that still a challenge?
It is. That's part of the initiatives and future planning I alluded to earlier. We're looking to continue with our communications upgrades and our IT upgrades in the future. Again, it's always, I don't have to tell you, sir, but it's always difficult administering a budget. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices between the things you need and the things you want. But we're on a path and look forward to continuing the conversation with this committee about those things.
Yeah, no, and I think you guys are doing a great job in moving down that road. Let me ask you this, Director. You mentioned briefly the earning caps. Have we sufficiently addressed that, particularly for election years where you have multiple, particularly presidential, where you have huge overtime issues that come up? Have we adequately addressed that for you all yet, or is there still problems there?
So the answer is yes, and thank you. But it's definitely a fix. It's not a long-term solution. I would suggest that as we continue to grow our workforce, those demonstrable needs for excessive overtime should come down. I don't think we'll ever have a Secret Service where there won't be overtime needs, just because the operational tempo is just
sure.
exponentially growing. But I do think that this relief from the pay cap is certainly absolutely critically necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient just in terms of long-term appeal. This is a difficult job, as you know, sir, having been in law enforcement. And,
right.
All these efforts certainly help with morale, but I do have concerns moving forward with regard to long-term retention as people are having to kind of work excessively, because that cap doesn't remove the cap entirely. It just creates a new and better cap.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I look forward to working with you on that particular issue, because I think that's something that we really need to address. If you're going to continue to be able to meet your operational tempo, particularly during these peak years, and then maintain your adequate staffing during those other off years, I think it's going to be critical that we address that. So thank you very much for your leadership over there. I hear really good things from the rank and file. And Madam Chair, I see my time has run out. I will yield back.
Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for calling today's hearing. Mr. Murray, my first question is about the agency's medical operations. Last year, I heard from a constituent who was worried about her spouse, a Secret Service agent based in the Chicago field office, because she felt that the agency's COVID precautions and testing regime was not sufficient to keep her family safe. Can you briefly detail what measures you have in place to protect your agents, and what are your testing protocols, and where are you on vaccinations?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your question. So, again, back early in 2020, during our COVID experience, we were very clear that we needed to do a lot of things with regard to technology to be able to allow our workforce to work virtually. We were happy to accomplish that. We were happy to capitalize on some PPE opportunities that we had. But at the same time, we did work with our chief medical officer, as well as other folks in the White House Medical Unit. And more importantly, we have a long-standing relationship with Johns Hopkins University Medical Center folks, and we work with them to develop our own testing protocol here in the National Capital Region, as well as developing policies and practices for folks out in the field, like the folks in Chicago you mentioned. So the testing is sort of by design. It's not like everybody comes in every day. If folks are on a continual protective assignment, they'll get tested in a certain cycle. So let's say every 48 hours or every 72 hours. Along the same lines, if somebody is a field agent or a field officer, he or she would come in and get tested before they travel, and then in the appropriate time frame after they return from that protective travel. Thus far here, we've tested more than 20,000 people. We've conducted more than 20,000 tests right here in this building. That's probably about half of what we've done over at the White House Medical Unit. And then we have worked with our field offices to set up testing opportunities out in the field as well.
Right. As you may know, I led an effort to require CBP to stand up an interoperable electronic health record system, which is currently in progress. And the pandemic has only made the need for this system even more apparent. As a nurse, I know that implementing electronic health records can be beneficial not only for ensuring appropriate care for people in DHS custody, but also for improving the health of the DHS workforce itself. Mr. Murray, do you agree that the Secret Service could benefit from standing up an electronic health record system?
Definitely, ma'am. I'd like to learn. I can't say I know a whole lot about that, but definitely sounds like something that would enhance our operations. Look forward to talking to you about it.
Thank you. And with my remaining time, I'd like to hear about what steps you're taking to improve the agency's operational planning and preparation based on lessons learned over the past year. Like many Americans, I was shocked by the use of force by multiple federal agencies to disperse a peaceful protest in Lafayette Square last summer for a photo op. As you know, the Secret Service deployed pepper spray as part of that response. A few months later, the Capitol was overrun by an armed insurrectionist chanting threats against the vice president. Despite the fact that this attack was plotted openly on publicly available websites, the federal response was much less robust. While the disparate responses to this event is a complicated issue that extends far beyond your agency, I'm interested in what steps you're taking internally to improve the Secret Service's operations in the future and ensure that your agents are trained and prepared to protect our country's leaders and critical infrastructure from legitimate attacks. Mr. Murray, what has the Secret Service learned from these events and what changes have you implemented as a result?
Thank you, ma'am. Obviously, no matter where we go or what we do on the protective side of the house, we're always going to conduct an after-action review. We did after the experiences we had late last May and early last June. We certainly did. Obviously, on January 6th, we started our day with a different event down at the Ellipse, but we were up there with the Vice President Pence at the time, at the Capitol as well. So conducted after-action review there. You know, I could tell you that we definitely looked to improve on our processes writ large with respect to what happened in Lafayette Park on June 1st. Secret Service did have a supporting role. As you mentioned, there was an instance where our officers were assigned to secure a intersection so that other law enforcement can get out and perform their operations. And when they did go over a barrier, a couple of our officers were assaulted by folks. And that's why they used the pepper spray, as you mentioned. You're absolutely correct, ma'am. The vast majority of people that were out there, especially during the daylight hours, were out there expressing their First Amendment rights. And that is a critical part of our training, and that is a huge consideration anywhere we go in this country conducting protective operations. But it's also true, as the days gone on and we got into the evening, other folks came in who weren't only there to express their First Amendment rights, and things did become violent.
Director Murray, I thank you for your service, but that was not my question. We are all familiar about the events of that day. I asked what the Secret Service has learned and what he changed operationally. Since my time has expired, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the director to submit that information for the record in writing and hope that, you know, perhaps next time we can be more direct. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Next is Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member. I appreciate the opportunity to have this be a part of this hearing. Director Murray, thank you. Thank you for your years of service. Also want to thank you for your service in the Army Reserves. I'm also in the Army National Guard. So you have a career of service to our nation. So thank you for that. A part about, you know, the bad thing about going last or close to the end is almost all the questions have already been answered. I want to echo what Representative Henson was talking about when it comes to, you know, the cyber crimes and financial crimes that are taking place. But if we could we dig a little deeper, and can you identify some of our the foreign actors that are actively engaged? I mean, we know we have external threats. I mean, we serve on the Homeland Security Committee, and you know, we know who the bad people are out there. But can you kind of identify them for us, and you know, how active and how entrenched are they?
So yes, sir. I'll do my best. Obviously, it's a little bit of a sensitive topic, and I'll try to address it broadly, and be happy to come back up and discuss it in more appropriate forum. But I will say this: when it comes to these transnational groups, you have people that are they are bright people and they're highly proficient when it comes to cyber. And when we're talking about something that is organically and solely a financial crime, more often than not, then they're working for themselves to fund their own efforts. But what we have found working with our partners, both in the intelligence community and in law enforcement here federally, that these same cyber actors sometimes are working on behalf of foreign governments and conducting state-sponsored operations as well. So that's why it's particularly concerning to, broadly speaking, federal law enforcement, and why we try to focus in on those efforts and disrupt to the best of our ability.
Yeah, and I know you probably can't go into too much detail, but we would love to have an opportunity to chat more about that.
Sure.
And I want to thank you for setting up a cyber fraud task force in the state of Mississippi alongside of our Attorney General. That's extremely important. And I know you also, and Representative Rutherford brought this up, you were talking about, recruitment and retention. And is there anything else you'd like to share with us? I know with the private sector pay, this is across the government, all agencies. It's kind of hard to compete now. It used to be it was the best job you could have would be working for the Secret Service or the FBI or another federal agency. Probably not the IRS, right? But the other agencies. So is there anything else that you'd like to bring up about how we can not only recruit the best and brightest, but also retain them?
Yes, sir. Thanks very much for that question. And again, the fact that we are able to better retain them is due in no small part to the support of this committee. But I'll say this, law enforcement is a tough job. I'm the son of a police officer. Federal law enforcement is a tough job. And I would, with the greatest respect to my partners in federal law enforcement, there's no tougher job than the Secret Service. It's extremely demanding. It's a rigorous lifestyle, and it requires a lot, not just from the people who serve in the agency, but from the people who love and support us. So as you go through your career and you realize that, and you realize that there might be other jobs that are similar, maybe not the same, that aren't as demanding, sometimes people have to make life choices, and we respect that. So we're looking to incentivize folks to stay. Likewise, to your question, it is tough because right now, whether it's the Secret Service or the FBI or DEA or HSI, we're all going after the same applicant pool. Right, the folks that are coming out of the military or college, wherever they're coming from, that want to come into federal law enforcement, they're all looking at all these different agencies. So we're doing our best to make ourselves the most attractive to them. Candidly, there is a little bit of a vocational element to being in the Secret Service. I always tell people it's the greatest job in the world because I want to be here. If I didn't want to be here, it might not be the greatest job in the world. So we're looking for those people who really kind of want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And be part of this sort of weird thing that we do here with this dual mission. But you're spot on. It always has been a challenge, and it's something that we're trying to rise to.
Well, Director, in this current climate, and the things that we see on the news and the things that we hear, the defund the police movement and all that crazy nonsense that's coming out. Obviously, we support legitimate reforms. But, I believe we should be funding our police more, not less, if we want them to have better training, attract better talent, even though here in South Mississippi, we've got an awesome law enforcement community. So with that, I see my time has expired. Director Murray, please let your men and women know and their families that we appreciate their service and sacrifice, and thank you for all that you do.
I will. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I want to follow up with Mr. Palazzo's questions. Specifically, if you could detail on a deeper dive a little bit more about what you're doing to recruit in non-traditional places. I know you talked about diversity at the opening in that vein. If you could give us a deeper dive on how you're trying to do that, to me, it's also an additional way that you can increase the spigot of people coming into your agency But what else are you doing? And specifically, what are the incentives that seem to work best to keep people in place?
Thank you, sir. So the one thing that we're doing that didn't exist when I was an applicant many, many years ago was we're doing all we can to not only leverage, but to exploit social media opportunities. Obviously, most of our applicants are much younger than I am, and they're very active online. So we're doing all we can to kind of reach out and create a level of engagement there. We're seeing some positive feedback. With respect to traditional recruiting, our folks are very active, not only here in headquarters, but out there in your districts where our offices are. Folks are pounding the pavement, not only talking to colleges, but we're reaching out to high schools, trying to put the idea in folks' minds that, hey, the Secret Service might be the place that you want to go. And certainly during these times of COVID, we've done a lot of that virtually. The retention programs that exist it's a broad spectrum, and I'm grateful for that, because I think different programs appeal to different age groups and different employees and different job series. As I mentioned earlier, folks that might be closer to retirement, they may be motivated to stay a little longer because they know they're not hitting that pay cap and working for nothing, so to speak. Quite literally, before we had that option, you would get your pay statement every 2 weeks, and you would look and you would see the money you made, and then it would tell you, here's all the other money you also earned, but you're never going to get paid. So if you're close to retirement, it's kind of an easy choice, right? Conversely, for folks that are coming in at a younger age, they may have sizable loans from school, and we have the tuition reimbursement. They may have young families and with dual incomes, so there's the child subsidy efforts that we've been able to implement with your support. The one thing that does concern me moving forward is this retirement bubble that we run into every once in a while, and that's a result of sort of what used to be uneven hiring practices, where we would hire on demand, and then 20 years later, you'd have a bunch of folks that were ready to retire. So we are coming up against one here in fiscal year 2022. We're doing all we can to appeal to those folks to reconsider and stay, because candidly, those are our most experienced people. And I know the question came up earlier. The max out is a great fix. It's not a long-term solution to address those retirement bubbles. And it's probably something, even though we've corrected the hiring practices, it'll be something the agency endures for probably the next 10 or 15 years or more.
Yeah, and look, I think it helps us for you to report back with what works best or what changes in the future might help you with retention. You've just described a couple things that weren't the case when you came in, and that's changing year by year. So I believe this committee and others would be receptive to doing what's necessary to help in retention, but we certainly appreciate this. I guess the last point, if you could, in just the last 80 seconds, focus just a little more on the efforts to attract on a diversity basis.
So again, we invest a lot of time and energy, and we have for quite a while, but we redoubled our efforts into reaching out to, as I mentioned earlier, historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, your tribal colleges and universities, and then we applied a particular focus on women's organizations. I think it's true that everybody in law enforcement likes the idea of hiring, more women and more females. It's not a 50-50 proposition in law enforcement writ large. It's certainly not here. We've made great strides. When I graduated the academy 26 years ago, I think about 8% of our class was female, 8. Last week, I commissioned a class where more than half of the agents were female. So happy to report that we're making progress in that regard, but it's not a one and done type thing. It's something that we're invested in and we're going to continue to do over the months and years to come.
Thank you for your service, and thank you for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Director Murray. I wanted to ask a little bit more about NSSC, the events that you talked about, the National Special Security events, which have been defined, as you mentioned, by inauguration, General Assembly, those types of special events, large sporting events. Following January 6th, members of Congress have suggested designating additional congressional activities as these types of events. In your testimony, you talk a little bit about everything that you bring to the table when it comes to NSSEs. Can you talk a little bit about how those activities cannot be duplicated by other federal, state, and local agencies, but also what resources would the service need in order, if we designated additional NSSEs in upcoming fiscal years?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So as you know, sir, the NSSE is something that were born out of the experience we had back in '96 with the Centennial Park bombing. President Clinton, along with Congress, wanted to address the fact that there was a gap in coordination between all levels of law enforcement and public safety. And they came up with this NSSE model where the FBI is the lead for crisis response, FEMA is the lead for consequence management, and the Secret Service serves as the lead for operational security, design, planning, and execution. But the secret sauce, the true success of the NSSE process exists in the fact that it truly is a whole of government approach. It's where all these agencies come together well before an event is expected to happen, and they conduct this long-term planning. And we use a series of committees and subcommittees, and we've had great success. We just completed the 68th, which was President Biden's address to the joint session just a couple weeks back. And I do think that there are opportunities for other events to be considered NSSEs. As you know, neither the Secret Service nor the FBI nor FEMA are the ones who designate something as an NSSE. Typically, it's a request that comes from a governor. Here in DC, it can come from the mayor or come through us a couple different ways. But there are also some events such as UNGA, the conventions, the inauguration, and so on that are pre-designated. We do appreciate the funding we get of about $45 million per year, but candidly, it's not enough, and we do need more to be able to do 4 or 5 of these a year as it happens. And certainly, if the idea is to do even more NSSE events in the future, we'd be looking for more consideration from a budgetary standpoint.
You just mentioned, 4 or 5, additional. Let's use that as in the fiscal year. What would be necessary, financially to meet that goal and operationally?
Sir Ken, I'd have to get with my folks and kind of tally that up, but I'd love to come and talk to you further about that at some point if you have time.
Understood. Back to some of the cyber crimes that you talked about before. The cyber-enabled financial crimes have changed. In your testimony, you talked a little bit about that during the COVID-19 pandemic. How has the Secret Service been able to respond to those changes specific to what the pandemic has meant?
So, yes, sir. So along with taking efforts to protect our workforce and our protectees, the one thing we knew when this pandemic hit and we saw relief packages like the CARES Act, based on our prior experiences with things like Hurricane Katrina, we knew that as great as these opportunities were for citizens, it was also ripe with opportunity for people who wanted to commit fraud. So our initial effort, along with CISA and the FBI, was to get the word out there to the public and private sector to kind of be alert and make sure that they take the necessary preventative measures within their own organizations. At the same time, we dedicated a lot of our effort into just knocking down and disrupting the scams that we saw pop up early on. We weren't really concerned with building great cases initially. That being said, over the course of the past year, we have opened more than 750 COVID-related cases, fraud cases. We've seized in excess of $800 million. We've probably made more than 120 arrests specific only to COVID fraud. It's something that we're proud to have been sort of ahead of the ball on, but we also recognize that this is not something that's going to go away. The size of these packages are so notable, and the opportunities that exist are going to be persistent. We're going to be addressing COVID fraud for many years to come. And this is why it's so important that we want to keep investing in the modernization of our cyber fraud task forces.
Thanks, Director Murray. Yield back, Madam Chair.
That concludes the first round, and so we're now going to be starting with the second round. And as Mr. Palazzo said, practically every issue has already been covered. So, Director Murray, hopefully this will give you an opportunity also to elaborate more on some of the issues that have already been addressed. The increase in the variety and intensity of social media poses opportunities and challenges for you in terms of protective intelligence. What tools does the Secret Service use to gather protective intelligence online and through social media? And how are you adapting strategies and efforts to keep up with technology developments?
Thank you, ma'am. So several years back within our Protective Intelligence Division, which is the group that leads our threat management efforts, based here in headquarters, but it coordinates all of our threat investigations around the globe. Within that group, we established an open source investigation unit, which is comprised of both agents and analysts. They use certain sorts of equipment and software in order to be able to go out and identify any sort of threatening language or ideation that might exist in an open source platform. This is not something that's on the dark web. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that we have made some significant investment in, and we're looking to continually invest in this thing because, you know, with regard to technology and equipment, it's something that's always going to be advancing, probably at a rate faster than the multi-year budget permits us to address. Likewise, this is an area where we can really benefit from sort of targeted hiring, getting the right people in here to do this. It's not something that only an agent can do, and there's a lot of folks out there that are going to school right now to do this type of thing, studying, you know, cyber security and so forth.
One of the missions of the National Threat Assessment Center is to provide research and guidance to support public safety. What actionable guidance has the Secret Service developed through the Safe Schools initiative to reduce the occurrence of violence and the loss of lives in schools?
Thank you, ma'am. So we're very proud of the EventID, of the National Threat Assessment Center. It's something that's been up and running for more than 20 years now. Although we actually started it to enhance our own protective mission, it was pretty clear after incidents like Columbine that there were opportunities for our agency to give back to communities and share quite literally the science and math of how we protect our own protectees. After Virginia Tech, the White House asked us to become more involved in a more structured manner, and NTAC now not only focuses on schools, but they've conduct research and I should mention that NTAC is comprised of not just agents, but also analysts and social science research specialists. And their focus is to look historically at incidents that have taken place and conduct research on it and make recommendations. To date, they've published about 35 different products. The most recent one is one we're particularly proud of, and had to do with averted school attacks that have taken place over the past decade. They looked at 67 different averted school attacks. And that's where the folks there at the school or fellow students noticed that there might be something going on with the person who might commit this act, and they said something about it. And the takeaway there is that bystanders save lives. That was the point of that product, which was great because prior to that, we would always encourage, whether it was law enforcement, public safety, schools, that, you know, it's important to basically address the idea that somebody might be in trouble and might need help, and not to ignore the warning signs.
I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on the issue of financial and cyber crimes, and how the pandemic and increased reliance on the internet created opportunities for financial cyber crimes and investigative challenges for the Secret Service.
Yes, ma'am. Well, one thing we saw over the past 12 months, especially as the entire world sort of went remotely, was that there was an absence of a lot of checks and balances when it came to business processes. So if a company had somebody there who would either effect wire transfers at his or her desk, or they would approve things manually, these things were all being done virtually. And these transnational groups picked up on that early on, and they exploited these lack of physical controls. And what they would do is they would either socially engineer their way, or through an intrusion, they would get into these corporations and redirect those wire transfers to themselves, to what we call a money mule account, where the recipient, the account holder, is either a co-conspirator, or they perhaps might be unwitting, and then they're instructed to take whatever that dollar amount is and then transmit it back to the transnational group, to the cyber actors, via cryptocurrency.
Okay. What is the role of the cyber fraud task force in mitigating and investigating cyber crimes that are related to network intrusions in the finance sector?
Yes, ma'am. It's quite literally, it's our cyber fraud task forces who do combat that sort of activity. That is what their primary focus is on. And the cyber fraud task forces are comprised of not only the Secret Service, of course, but also federal, state, local partners, who most of which are trained through our NCFI. And they're looking to identify this sort of behavior, disrupt it, and prosecute it as well. And, you know, we've been very successful with seizure, but I think it's worth mentioning that the point of seizure of ill-gotten goods is not to turn it over to the agency. It's actually it's restitution, is to give it back to the victims. So we're very proud, and particularly with regard to the $800 million we've seen with regard to COVID fraud, we've been very successful in getting that money back to the victim organizations and individuals.
Okay. And what challenges exist with the increasing use of cryptocurrency for financial transactions, particularly on the dark web?
Yes, ma'am. So it's a challenge. I think it's worth saying, I've seen some reporting in the news about cryptocurrency. It's worth noting that cryptocurrency in and of itself is not inherently fraudulent. It's not designed for any illicit purpose. But the fact that it can be anonymized makes it a pretty good utility for somebody who wants to commit fraud. So what I mean by that is you can actually be anonymous as a sender and anonymous as a receiver of cryptocurrency. The vast majority of cryptocurrencies are legitimate, and they go through a legitimate and a valid exchange. And we know who the sender is, and we know who the receiver is. The one thing that works for the Secret Service is that we're pretty adept at following the money. So while we might not necessarily at first know who the sender or receiver is, we can follow the digital footprints with regard to the cryptocurrency itself, and then sort of reverse engineer our investigative efforts. And we've had a lot of success in that regard. And that's where, you know, the continual investment in not only the process, but the technology is going to help us in the months and years to come.
Thank you. Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Murray, following up, I understand that the Secret Service has redoubled its efforts to ensure that in-service and specialized training are a fundamental part of your operations. This subcommittee agrees with these efforts and contributed an additional $14 million above the request to support improvements at the James Raleigh Training Center. What is your assessment of current training operations at your Raleigh Training Center, especially as it relates to the in-service and specialized training required to keep your agents and officers at peak performance? And an additional question, sir, how have you applied the additional funding, and what are your priorities for ensuring the Raleigh Training Center meets the agency's requirements in the future, sir?
Thank you, sir. Well, first of all, thank you for your support in that regard. It was critical. We have made a lot of key investments with regard to in-service training. It was something that was lacking and still needs continual improvement here in the Secret Service. I do think as we increase our staffing, that'll also increase opportunity to expand opportunities for in-service training. Obviously, COVID made things a little bit challenging, but we were, as a result of that investment we made in expanding our bandwidth and our capability, we were able to deliver many, many thousands of hours of virtual training to our workforce over the past 14 months or so. As we come out of COVID, I'm very excited about the idea of not only inviting our workforce to come back into our Raleigh Training Center here in the National Capital Region, but also at the training center, we have a group that exists for the sole purpose of going out to the field, whether it's here domestically or around the world, to train not only our people, but all of our public safety and our law enforcement partners around the world who provide support to us for both protective and investigative measures. We've made a lot of infrastructure improvements, again, thanks very much to this committee. Within the last 18 months, we opened up our brand new state-of-the-art K-9 facility out there, which is a huge benefit for our program, and invite you and the rest of the members of the committee to come out there and not only visit the K-9 center, but also the entire training center. Long term, as I mentioned earlier, I think there are some critical opportunities that exist with regard to construction out there at the training center. As you know, in the wake of a fence jumping incident we had about 7 years ago, there was a panel that got together that made some recommendations as to how Secret Service can improve its operations. It was called the Protective Mission Panel. We have implemented pretty much all of those things, to include the White House fence. The one thing we haven't done, the one recommendation we have not been able to act on just yet, is the construction of a White House mock-up, or what we call the White House training facility. And I know I mentioned it earlier, but in the same way that the fence is going to be a game changer for us operationally, construction of a White House training facility would be a game changer for this agency and would also enhance national security across the board.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned several positive indicators, sir, with regard to recruiting, retention, and lower accession rates. But I want to dive a little deeper into another aspect that is deeply entrenched in these metrics: employee morale. Over the past few years, you've reported increased levels of morale among your workforce. Would you like to share some of the efforts undertaken that have helped drive these particular metrics in a positive direction, sir?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thanks for your support in that regard as well. So certainly happy with some of the markers that we've seen in terms of upward trends in employee morale. We do look at things like the Federal Employment Viewpoint Survey, certainly important to us. But as positive as some of those things might be, it also illuminates the fact that, well, two things really. The fact that our engagement matters, and it also shines a light on the fact that there's a lot more work to do. So that's one thing we've done a lot more of over the last several years, is continual engagement with our workforce. Even with regard to COVID, we're constantly sending out messages to our workforce. Early on, we wanted to make sure we were addressing their concerns and their needs. We, utilized surveys and conducted town halls on the matter, and so on and so forth. Candidly, our employees seem to like to know about legislative affairs that are going on. So even hearings like this we put out there, and hopefully some of them are watching us right now. But I think the fact that there is engagement with the workforce across all job series seems to be received well. And I want our workforce to know just how proud we are of them, and I am of them. And it's an extremely difficult job. Some folks laugh when I say it, but I always joke when I say there is no Coke to our Pepsi. We're a very different kind of agency because of this dual mission. We are very much like an expeditionary force that goes out and never comes back, like a Navy ship that never comes back to port. And so that makes us highly reliant on each other. And I think, like anybody else in life, it's the importance of being heard. So I think if there's any positive trends, it's hopefully because our workforce feels like they're being heard, because they are.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the chance for a second round. I'll use it to ask for clarification of a couple of earlier answers, and if time permits, to raise an additional area. Mr. Director, I appreciated your response to my earlier question about campaign events, in particular circumstances where protection might pose grave risks to the protectors, to your agents, and the chance you have to offer feedback in advance of such things. I just want to make sure I understand your answer on the Walter Reed automobile ride in particular, because what you said was news to me, maybe not to others. I understood you to say that before the president, who was clearly hospitalized for COVID, that the Secret Service was given the opportunity to assess the possibility of protection if he took such a ride, and then that you granted that you clearance, and then the agents who were in the car with him were given a degree of PPE or whatever protection that was equivalent to what the hospital workers had. That I had not heard that. Can you elaborate on that just a bit, or at least confirm it?
Yes, sir. So whether it's that instance or anywhere we take any of our protectees, we're going to do an advance. If we're going to go overseas, obviously that advance is going to be pretty extensive. If we find out tonight that one of our protectees wants to go to some location for dinner, we're going to do an advance. A protective advance was what I mean. And so we certainly did that. It's just a intensive advanced planning. Granted, I don't think that our agents had a whole lot of time to do it, but in order to determine whether or not it was achievable, they had to have conversations with the medical staff from the White House Medical Unit, the medical staff from Walter Reed, and then beyond that, they had to make sure they can create a safe and secure environment for that motorcade ride or whatever it was. But to answer your other question, yes, sir, the two individuals in the vehicle were fully outfitted in PPE, if that's the right terminology.
Yes, and of course here, the additional element in evaluation is whether this can be done in a way that is safe for the protectors, for your agents. Yes. That is, I would think, not a focus of most of these advanced assessments in ordinary times. If I could circle back to January 6th, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that January 6th was not determined to be a national security event. Is that true?
That's correct. It was not an NSSC on January 6th, correct.
I do think it's a sad day in this country when routine counting of the electoral votes, ensuring the peaceful transfer of power, has to be declared a national security event. But that does seem to be where we are. Can you offer some clarification as to what difference it would have made had such a declaration been in place in terms of your agency's role?
Sure. So I'll start by saying, I think it was 2 days after January 6th, it was determined by the then acting Secretary of Homeland Security that we would slide the designation date for the inauguration 12 days earlier to go ahead and make sure we were absolutely mission ready for the inauguration. So in answer to your question, could it have been done to push it before January 6th? Conceivably, yes. But the real benefit of NSSC planning is to have a long lead time and to have the opportunity for all these agencies to sort of work together. We would not have had that. I do want to say, though, that I'm aware that in mid to late December, a lot of the agencies here, to include U.S. Capitol Police, Secret Service, Metropolitan Police Department, they were involved in pre-coordination meetings about what could happen in the National Capital Region on January 6th. I think there were more than half a dozen of those meetings. Obviously, I'm aware that the former chief, Steve Sund, testified not too long ago up there. And I'm also aware that one of the things he conveyed is that, he would have preferred to have had more people, more resources, more fencing to be able to effectuate and push out his perimeter. And I couldn't agree more. And had it been established to be an NSSC, that's one of the things you would have seen. You would have seen more people, you would have seen more perimeter fencing, you would have seen more resources. But to your point, sir, it doesn't need to be an NSSC to achieve that. You don't need to have the designation to have all those things.
Thank you. That's helpful. My time's about to expire. I do want to commend you on the agency's report on averting targeted school violence issued in March. I will have some questions for the record about the implications of that report. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Henson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second round of questions. And thank you, Director Murray, for sticking it out as well. Just had one follow-up based on kind of my earlier line of questioning. You talked a lot in just the past few minutes about preventative measures within organizations that you work with, disrupting the scams that are out there, and then some of the seizures and arrests that the Secret Service has made with fraud and financial crimes. So I guess, obviously we know you're working on all these things. What can Iowans and American citizens actually do to protect themselves against being the victims of these kinds of financial crimes that your organization is investigating?
The first step is simple cyber hygiene, and it sounds silly, I know, but it's just making sure that we are always diligent with regard to our own personal devices and our own personal access to the things that matter. From a organizational or a business standpoint, it's basically identifying somebody, and they don't have to be a subject matter expert, but identifying somebody to sort of be the marshal for all things that matter in terms of resiliency and continuity of operations for your organization. And that certainly includes cyber. As I mentioned earlier, I do think that we are all, as a society, guilty of, up to very recently, thinking of this as something as nice to have. But moving forward, I think we need to realize in the public and private sector, this is something that we need to have. If I may give a quick example of a recent public utility that suspected that it might have been the subject of cyber crime. This public utility contacted one of our cyber fraud task forces, one of our agents, and a local sheriff's officer who'd been trained at NCFI went out there. And when they got there, they were advised that this public utility saw some anomalous activity in some of their gauges. And they suspected that somebody might be controlling it remotely. And that's entirely possible. But here's the problem. That public utility had not implemented any controls whatsoever. So there was no way to tell what the baseline was, what was normal and what happened. And if I could give you a real life example, I know in the world of Ring doorbells, things are differently, but years ago, if you came home to your house and you saw the window was broken, that's all you saw, you didn't know whether somebody was trying to break into your house or if it was just some kids playing ball and the ball hit the house and they ran away. And that's effectively what that public utility had there in front of them. So they have to invest on the front end. They have to have, some protective measures in place, because when you don't, there are no digital footprints or fingerprints for investigators to trace.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Murray. Appreciate your time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
I believe there are no more questions. Mr. Murray, I was just double checking to see if Mr. Fleischman, are you signaling that you have another question?
I do not, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say thank you for another outstanding hearing. It was substantive and productive, and I wanted to thank the director. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, I just want to remind you about the request by Ms. Underwood with regards to the use of force and your commitment to respond in writing to the committee with regards to her question. Yes, and also because we are ending a little bit early and have some time, and the fact that this subcommittee has a great deal of respect for the Secret Service and the men and women of the Secret Service. I just want to I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just want to give you an opportunity, if there is any issue or question that was not asked that you would like this subcommittee to perhaps have more information about, I would like to give you this opportunity to do that now.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope it doesn't ring hollow, but we really do appreciate the continued support of this subcommittee. We're highly reliant on you, and we have a fantastic relationship with your senior staff, for which we're very, very grateful. I appreciate the open lines of communication. I'd like to, when the time is right and COVID permits, I'd like to invite everybody to come out to the Raleigh Training Center and down to the National Computer Forensics Institute to take a look at the good work that not only our people are doing, but with regard to NCFI, the good work all the law enforcement officers in your communities are doing as well. But I thank you very much, and I appreciate all you've done for us, and I appreciate the fact that you recognize the hard work of our employees.
Thank you, and we will be taking that visit.
Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, Mr. Murray, very much for being here. The Subcommittee on Homeland Security stands adjourned.